Describe the emotional impact of spending Mother's Day alone, expecting calls, visits, or appreciation, but receiving none. Set the tone of isolation and unmet expectations. It's funny, the way silence can fill a room. You think silence is just the absence of noise, but on days like Mother's Day, it isn't quiet, it's loud. Deafening even. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that morning, coffee gone cold in front of me, scrolling through social media like it was going to fill the void. Post after post, mothers wrapped in the arms of their children, handwritten cards on nightstands, breakfast in bed photos with little messy trays and lopsided pancakes. I kept scrolling like maybe I'd find one that would make me feel different. But every scroll just pressed harder on that quiet ache in my chest. I hadn't expected a parade. I didn't need flowers or some perfect brunch. I would have taken a simple text. I love you, Mom. Something. Anything. Now I know our kids grow up. They get busy. They forget. But no matter how much you rationalize it, there's something about sitting alone on a day that's meant to be about the love between a mother and her children that just lands differently. You feel it. You feel it in your gut. So I tried to do what we're all told to do. Shift the energy. I made myself a nice breakfast. Eggs, toast, a little fruit I sliced up like I was hosting someone. I set the table. One plate. One mug. Put on music in the background. That fake it to make kind of thing. And for a moment I almost believed it. I almost convinced myself that this was enough. But then I sat down. And that's when it hit me. The chair across from me empty. The way the sun came in through the window like it didn't care what day it was. The smell of the toast, which now just reminded me of Sunday mornings when my son was little and we'd make waffles together. Well, make is a generous word. He'd pour flour all over the floor and eat chocolate chips from the bag. And I'd laugh. And we'd take turns burning things. And now here I was. Toast, music, sun, silence. And it's not just about one day. It's what that silence symbolizes. It's the culmination of 100 small gaps that grew into a canyon over the years. Missed calls, short texts, holidays that turned into group chats and emojis instead of phone calls. And you start to wonder, did I do it wrong? Did I not show up enough? Or too much? Did I smother him? Did I forget how to give him space when he needed it? You go down that spiral, and on a day like Mother's Day, there's nothing stopping you. But then here's the thing. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the plate. I didn't call and demand an apology. I just sat there, eating eggs like a woman who had decided she was going to endure it, because that's what we do. We endure. We hold space for the pain and smile through it. We say we're fine when our hearts are quietly breaking. Not because we want to lie, but because we don't want to make anyone else feel bad. Especially not our kids. Kept checking my phone. The battery was low, but I let it die. I thought, if he texts, he'll text. If he doesn't, I'll be okay. And that's a lie too. I wouldn't be okay. Not really. But I'd survive it. I'd get through the day. Just like I had gotten through so many others where love didn't look the way I hoped it would. And just when I thought that would be it, the quiet, the ache, the almost laughable loneliness of it all, there was a knock at the door. That sound, out of nowhere, broke the trance. I didn't even jump up right away. I wasn't expecting anyone. I wasn't waiting on a delivery. It was Mother's Day. I figured it was a neighbor or someone who had the wrong house. But I got up, opened the door. And that's when everything changed. You ever have one of those moments where your brain just doesn't catch up to what's happening? Like something totally ordinary is happening, but your gut is telling you, pay attention. This isn't what it seems. That's exactly what it felt like when I opened the door and saw him standing there. Just a regular delivery driver. Box in hand. Little smile on his face. Nothing dramatic. Just a guy doing his job. But even in that moment something felt off. He looked a little confused himself. Kind of glanced down at the label again, then back up at me. Delivery for, he paused, looked again. Yeah, this address. Here you go. I didn't even think to question it. I hadn't ordered anything, but maybe someone had sent me something for Mother's Day. That happens, right? Surprise. A last-minute gift. Maybe he had remembered. My heart actually skipped a little bit because you don't want to hope, but you do. That tiny seed of possibility sneaks in before you can stop it. Took the box. It was small, light. No big branding or anything. Just a plain brown package, with a handwritten label. No card on top. I thanked him, closed the door, and walked it to the kitchen like I was carrying a fragile truth. Now, I didn't tear into it like it was Christmas morning. I took my time because I'd already been sitting in so much quiet that day. I figured, what's a few more seconds? I unwrapped it slowly, expecting maybe some kind of trinket, a mug, maybe even one of those weird homemade gift boxes people send from Etsy with tea bags and a candle. But instead, inside the box was an envelope. Just an envelope. No name on the outside. No stamp, no return address. Just sealed, and clearly placed with intention. I stared at it for a second, and again, something didn't feel right. It didn't feel like a gift. Felt personal. Heavy even though it weighed nothing. My fingers started to tingle a little, because it was like my body knew before my mind did that this wasn't meant for me. But I opened it anyway. 'Cause of course I did. Because when you're a mom, and your son has been distant, and it's Mother's Day and you've already built up 1,000 stories in your head about where he is and why he didn't call, you open the envelope. You need to open the envelope. And what I found inside, it wasn't a card. It wasn't even a letter in the traditional sense. It was a confession. A handwritten note, raw and unfiltered, like someone had poured their heart out without ever intending anyone else to read it. It was addressed not to me, but to someone else entirely. A name I didn't recognize. A woman I assumed. And it was signed by my son. Now let me tell you something. There's a very particular kind of shock that happens when you read something so personal from someone you love, something you were never supposed to see. It's like the air gets sucked out of the room. Time doesn't just slow down, it pauses. Every sentence I read made me feel like I was eavesdropping on his soul. He was confessing something. Something real. Something deep. Things he hadn't said to anyone. Not even me. He talked about feeling ashamed, about hiding parts of who he was. About struggling with decisions he'd made. Things he regretted. Truths he was just starting to accept about himself. And he kept apologizing. Not just to this person, but it felt like to himself. Over and over again. And here I was on Mother's Day reading this letter that wasn't even meant for me, yet somehow, it told me more about my son than I'd heard in years. That's when the confusion kicked in. The disbelief. The mental gymnastics. Did he send this to me on purpose? Was this his way of telling me something without saying it? Did he want me to see it? Or was it a mistake? Did the delivery driver mess it up? Did my son hand it off to the wrong address? Was I holding a secret that was never supposed to land in my hands? The questions came fast, and none of them had answers. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. My son was hurting. And I didn't know. Had no idea. I was sitting at a kitchen table that morning feeling sorry for myself, feeling invisible. And the truth was, he had been invisible too in his own way. Hiding. Carrying something alone. Maybe for years. That shook me. Because all we want as parents is for our kids to come to us. To trust us. To know we can handle their mess, their fear, their truth. And yet, here was proof, on Mother's Day of all days, that my son had been carrying a part of himself that he didn't feel safe enough to show me. I stood there holding that letter like it was glass, reading and rereading the words that weren't mine to read, realizing in real time that this day was no longer about being alone. It was about seeing something I was never supposed to see. I remember just staring at that letter like maybe if I read it enough times it would change. Like maybe the words would rearrange themselves into something less personal, less painful, less real. But they didn't. They just sat there, heavy and honest, completely unapologetic in their truth. The handwriting was definitely his. That familiar, half-rushed scrawl from years of school papers and birthday cards he'd signed in a hurry. No doubt about it, it was his. And every line pulled me deeper into a world I didn't know he was living in. He wrote about fear. Not the big, dramatic kind that gets posted online or makes it into movies. No, this was the quiet kind. The kind that lives in the background, that whispers to you when you're trying to fall asleep. The kind that keeps you editing yourself around the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. He wrote, "I wish I could say this out loud, but I can't. I don't know how." That line stopped me cold. Because if I'm being honest, I always thought we had that kind of relationship. You know, the kind where he could say anything out loud. I've always told myself I was the kind of mom who would listen, who wouldn't judge, who would hold space for whatever he was going through. But here it was, in his own words. I can't. That stings in a very particular way. Not because I was angry at him, but because suddenly, I had to question everything I believed about myself as a parent. What had I missed? What had I said or not said that made him feel like silence was safer than honesty? He kept writing like he was trying to pour years of bottled-up truth into this one letter. And it wasn't just about some secret or confession. It was about him. All of him. His shame, his confusion, his guilt, his longing to be seen. Not just accepted but understood. And I realized as I kept reading that this wasn't about some single moment. This had been building, quietly, for a long time. He mentioned how he'd tried to tell me once. That made me pause. I went back and reread that part. "I almost told you after dinner that night in the car," he wrote. "But you looked tired. And I didn't want to make things harder." That broke me. 'Cause I remembered that night. I remember us sitting in the driveway, me talking about work or bills or something trivial. I remember him being quiet like he had something on his mind. And I didn't push. I didn't ask. I just told him to get some sleep and I went inside. And now, years later, I find out that was the moment. The one he was going to open up. And I missed it. It's wild, isn't it? How we can be right next to someone and have no idea what they're carrying. We think we know. We think love is enough to make them feel safe. But sometimes, love isn't loud enough to drown out the noise in their own heads. I sat at my kitchen table holding that letter, feeling like I'd been dropped into the middle of a conversation that had started long before I even showed up. And I wanted so badly to talk back, to underline parts of it and write in the margins. "You can tell me. I'm listening now. I'm sorry I didn't see it." But that's not how letters work. You read. You absorb. You sit with it. And I sat with it for a long time. Every few sentences, I'd stop and breathe like I needed to take breaks just to handle the weight of it. And I remember thinking how unbelievably brave it was. This letter. Even though it wasn't meant for me, it was still the most honest thing I'd ever seen from him. And part of me was honored to see it. To know him more completely. And part of me felt like I was trespassing on sacred ground. But most of all I felt heartbreak. Not for me, not because of the loneliness earlier that day, but for him. For everything he carried alone. For the version of him I never got to meet because he thought he had to hide. That's the moment everything shifted. Because suddenly, the story of that day wasn't about a mother eating breakfast alone. It wasn't about being forgotten. It was about realizing my son hadn't forgotten me. He'd just been afraid of losing me. And fear will make you quiet. It'll make you disappear even when you're right in front of someone. I folded the letter back up like it was a piece of glass, afraid it might shatter in my hands. My heart was already cracked wide open. And all I could think was, he didn't know I'd read it. He didn't know I knew. At some point, the letter stopped feeling like something I stumbled on by accident, and started feeling like a mirror. Not of him, not just of my son, but of all the ways we think we're protecting each other by staying silent. All the things we don't say, all the moments we let slip by because we're afraid of making things awkward or too heavy or too real. And the more I sat with his words, the more I realized. This wasn't just a confession. It was a story of someone who had spent years trying to find the courage to be seen. He wrote about how hard it was to carry two versions of himself. There was the one he showed the world, polite, smart, responsible, the one I always bragged about to friends. And then there was the version he hid. The one who questioned himself, who didn't have it all together, who had made mistakes and didn't know how to talk about them. He said it felt like living in two different bodies. And he was tired. Exhausted, really. Not because he didn't want to tell the truth, but because he didn't know if he could handle what might happen after. And here's the part that stuck with me more than anything else. He wrote, "I didn't keep it from you because I didn't love you. I kept it from you because I didn't want to disappoint you." That one sentence nearly undid me. Because as parents, we tell ourselves we're giving unconditional love. We say it out loud. "You can come to me with anything. I'll always be here. There's nothing you could ever say that would make me stop loving you." But do we really create the space where our kids believe that? Or do they hear those words, but then feel us tense up when they get too emotional? Do they see us flinch when they reveal something we don't understand? Do they pick up on the little ways we try to steer the conversation away from their discomfort? He didn't write specifics, and I think that was intentional. But there were hints, pieces of guilt, references to parts of himself I'd never seen. A part of his identity he'd tried to bury. Relationships he'd hidden. People he'd cut off to keep his secret intact. I still didn't know exactly what he was confessing, but I didn't need the details. I could feel the pain in the gaps between the words. It was someone begging to be accepted, even if he couldn't say it out loud. And I realized then that it didn't matter how much I thought I had made it safe for him. What mattered was that he didn't feel safe enough to come to me when it counted. I started remembering conversations we'd had over the years. Casual ones that suddenly felt heavier in hindsight. The time I brushed off something he said about needing space as teenage moodiness. Or when he mentioned a friend I never met, and I didn't ask questions because I was too busy. Or the way he'd laugh a little too hard when he told me everything was fine. How many signs had I missed? Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to ask better questions. Or worse, because deep down maybe I didn't want to know. Maybe a part of me preferred the polished version of his life. The easy narrative. The one where he was fine, and I didn't have to confront anything messy or complicated. And that's a hard truth to sit with. We all want to believe we know the people closest to us. But sometimes what we really know is the version of them they feel safe enough to show us. And that gap, the space between who they are and who we think they are, that's where the real heartbreak lives. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from this overwhelming sense of clarity. Finally understood. He wasn't being distant because he didn't care. He was being distant because he was scared. Scared that if I really saw all of him, I'd pull away. That I'd look at him differently. And the wildest part. That thought had never once crossed my mind. But he'd been carrying it like armor. And here's what hit me the hardest. I'd spent the entire day feeling forgotten, when in reality, he had been carrying me in his heart the entire time. Not the version of me who wanted flowers or a phone call, but the one he didn't want to disappoint. He hadn't forgotten. He had been remembering me every day in the most painful, intimate way possible. That's what a confession really is. It's not just a truth. It's a risk. A risk that says, I trust you enough to see me. And the fact that I saw it, even by mistake, meant I had a choice to make. What I did with that truth would define everything that came next. The next few hours were a blur. I kept that letter close like it was a lifeline. I didn't know what to do with it. Should I tell him I read it? Should I wait for him to reach out first? Should I pretend it never came and just send it back quietly with no explanation? There's no manual for this kind of thing. When you accidentally stumble into someone else's pain, someone you love, and realize that you're part of the reason it's been buried. The weight of that letter wasn't just in what it revealed. It was in the silence that followed it. Because once you know something, you can't unknow it. I couldn't go back to being the version of myself that didn't know my son was carrying all of that. I couldn't go back to pretending things were fine when they clearly weren't. And the longer I sat with it, the more I realized that the biggest mistake I could make now was doing nothing. It's so easy to stay in our heads, to overthink every possible outcome. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I make it worse? What if he pulls away even more? But in the middle of all that anxiety, there was this one quiet thought that cut through all the noise. Do something anyway. Not because it would be perfect. Not because I had the right words. But because love isn't always about knowing what to say. It's about being willing to show up anyway. So I sat down. And I wrote him a letter. Not a dramatic one. Not some emotional essay about how heartbroken I was or how he should have come to me sooner. I didn't try to fix it. I just spoke to him like a mom who finally saw something she hadn't seen before. I told him I got a delivery by mistake. I told him I read the letter. And then I told him the truth. I told him I was proud of him. Not just for writing it but for carrying all that and still being kind. Still being decent. Still showing up in the world, even when it was hard. I told him I didn't need to know every detail. That I didn't need to understand everything right away. I just needed him to know that nothing he could say would change how deeply I loved him. And then I said the hardest part, I'm sorry. Not in the vague, blanket way we sometimes say it. I told him I was sorry I hadn't seen him sooner. Sorry if I ever made him feel like he had to edit himself around me. Sorry for the times I brushed off something he needed to say. And I meant it. I wasn't trying to guilt him or pull him closer. I just wanted him to know that I was owning my part. I put the letter in a new envelope, along with his, and left it at his door. No big scene. No expectations. Just a quiet offering. And let me tell you something. Waiting after you make yourself vulnerable like that. It's excruciating. Days went by. No call. No text. No knock at my door. I second-guessed everything. Maybe I shouldn't have admitted I read it. Maybe I made it worse. Maybe he's angry. But even in that spiral, I kept coming back to the same thing. At least he knows now. At least he doesn't have to wonder. Because sometimes the most healing thing we can offer someone is the chance to be seen and still loved. And then one night the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. It was late, dark out. I opened the door and there he was. My son. No words, not at first. Just him, standing there like he wasn't sure what to do next. And honestly, neither was I. But we didn't need a script. We didn't need a plan. He just walked in and hugged me. And I mean really hugged me. Not a polite, quick squeeze. The kind of hug that says thank you and I'm sorry and I'm tired and I'm here all at the same time. We sat down at the same table where I had eaten alone on Mother's Day. And he talked. Slowly at first. Carefully. But he talked. And I listened. Not to respond, not to fix, not to defend myself, just to understand. It wasn't perfect. Some things were hard to hear. Some things were hard for him to say. But it was real. And in that space, right there between the hurt and the healing, something new began to grow. Not a return to how things were before, but something deeper. More honest. And I realized that the delivery wasn't a mistake. It was an invitation. We all tell ourselves stories about how things are supposed to go. Holidays, relationships, motherhood. There's this quiet script running in the background, isn't there? You raise your kids, you love them fiercely, you show up over and over, and one day they grow into people who turn around and say, "Thanks, Mom." Call on Mother's Day. A hug. Card. Some gesture that says, "I see you." And when that doesn't happen, when the day comes and goes and it's just you and the quiet, you start to question the story you've been living in. But what I've learned, what I lived, is that sometimes the love you've been waiting for doesn't come the way you imagined. Sometimes it doesn't come with flowers or a phone call or a carefully wrapped gift. Sometimes it shows up in the form of a package delivered to your door by mistake. Sometimes it's buried in words you were never supposed to read. And sometimes it's so tangled in shame and fear that the person who loves you most doesn't even know how to hand it to you directly. And yet it's still love. That was the shift. That was the moment everything changed. I stopped looking at that letter as a wound and started seeing it as a bridge. Because what is a confession, really? Someone saying, "I want to be known." Even if it's messy. Even if it's complicated. Even if they don't know how to say it out loud. It's funny, before all this happened, I used to think connection came from conversations. Sitting down, having coffee, asking the right questions, being present. And yes, that matters. But now I understand that real connection starts long before the first word is ever spoken. It starts with creating an atmosphere. Tone. A quiet safety in the air that tells the people around you, you don't have to perform here. You don't have to edit. You're allowed to bring all of you into this room. And that's not something you say once. That's something you live day in and day out. When I sat across from my son after everything unfolded, what we were really doing was rebuilding the atmosphere between us. Not with big speeches. With presence. With honesty. With space. I wasn't trying to pry or get all the details. I just kept reminding him in small ways that he didn't have to be anything but himself here. That the ground was steady beneath him, even if he stumbled. And slowly, the more he talked, the more I started to realize. He wasn't the only one hiding. I'd been hiding too. Hiding behind busyness. Behind roles. Behind that quiet ache of not being needed as much anymore. I had let little hurts pile up over the years. Disappointments, distance, missed moments. And instead of facing them, I'd told myself, this is just how it is now. This is what happens when they grow up. But that's not the whole truth. Yes, our kids grow up. Yes, things change. But the relationship doesn't end. It evolves. And we have a say in what it becomes. But only if we're brave enough to show up for the version of the relationship that's real. Not just the one we wanted. And that's the piece I want you to hear. The relationship you dream of. The honest, open, connected one. It doesn't arrive fully formed. It's built. It's earned. Sometimes through laughter and easy moments. And sometimes through hard conversations and painful truth. But it's never too late. Not if you're willing to stop performing and start being. I used to think my role as a mom was about guiding, teaching, giving. But in that moment, with that letter, I realized my job wasn't just to give love. It was to receive it. Even when it came in an uncomfortable package. Even when it asked me to stretch. Even when it didn't look the way I expected. And that shift, it healed something in both of us. It gave him permission to tell more of his story. And it gave me permission to let go of the version of motherhood I thought I had to live up to. I stopped measuring my success as a mom by how often he called or what he said in public or what kind of card I got on a holiday. And I started measuring it by this. Can he come home and be fully himself? If the answer is yes, even once, then I've done something right. That Mother's Day didn't end with a bouquet or a brunch. It ended with something infinitely more sacred. The beginning of a new chapter. One rooted in truth. In presence. In the kind of love that isn't always pretty, but is always real. And that, I've learned, is more than enough.